I'm Leanne Jackson. Until recently, I was at the OECD, head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division, which, as most of you would know, annually produces an agricultural outlook with the Food and Agriculture Organization. And today, we're going to be talking about market outlook in general. I'm going to pass the floor over to Tassos in a minute to give you the high-level motivation and his views on the value of this gathering. But I would just say, from my perspective, now more than ever, in a world that seems to be defined by disruption, settling into looking at what science and evidence is telling us and to think about the future for the decisions that are happening now is more important than ever. So I think it's really great that people are taking the time to have this conversation. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Tassos, but before I do that, let me do a couple of housekeeping things. We have 4 panels today, 2 in the morning, a lunch break, and 2 in the afternoon. Each panel is about an hour and a half. We will carve out time to take questions from the floor as well, so you'll hear the panelists discuss the issues on the agenda, and then we'll open the floor for you. The sequence is we'll have Tassos set the stage, we'll have a panel on the big picture, the second panel is on arable crops outlook, and then in the afternoon we have an additional sector-specific panel on livestock, and then we'll wrap up with a panel that is titled What Could Go Wrong? So hopefully you'll stay with us till the end of the day for that last panel. We won't have coffee breaks, but you're invited to leave the room and grab coffee because the coffee will be available in where you were just having coffee all day long. And also just in case you need bathrooms, they're just past where the registration desk was, and there's one on the ground floor too. So can I invite you, please, to make sure that your phones are in silent mode and to mention to you that this event is going to be recorded, so that you're aware of that. So now, without further ado, I'll pass over to Tassos, who's going to help us set the stage. And I guess maybe he needs an introduction, although I doubt it. So Tassos is the Special Advisor for Sustainable Productivity for the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, and he's also working as a Senior Guest Research Scholar at YASA. The floor is yours.
Yeah, that's me. In my previous life, good morning, everybody. I started my career, digging deep into agricultural market outlook exercises. This is the second time we attempt this from the forum. We did something similar last October. We ended up with a strike, which limited participation. We know that there are too many people registered for this event, so probably they wouldn't fit in the room. But being away for 4 months now in Greece for personal reasons, I had forgotten the atmosphere in Brussels and how people come moving out with all the parallel meetings I have. I mention that because what we're about to discuss is something that has a very important relevance for all the foreign policy debates. But my personal view, having been around quite some time, is that we're paying less and less attention to the big trends that are taking place. I did an article last year on LinkedIn in parallel with the workshop we had. We had the sexy title to receive attention about the blissful linearity of market outlook. And I didn't use the term blissful linearity to criticize those that are doing agricultural outlook, including myself, but just to make a reference to all the uncertainties that characterize it, which Leanne and her colleagues and myself in my previous life and Ben's here know very well. So what I would like to go over with you, I was a graduate of the University of Georgia, I had to put something that reminds of REM there. It's the end of the world as we know it. What we don't know is where things are going to go. And what I would like to focus briefly is the big picture challenges that farming is facing, and not only farming, and that are unprecedented, both in nature and scope, at least for our generation. And I belong to those now that are retired, so it's hard to realize it. But anyway, that for all this world that we knew that was based on certain principles or rules, everything seems to have turned upside down. There is an impact of recent major market disturbances that has been felt on higher food prices, and I'll make a reference to that. But there are also impacts from longer-term trends on trade, science, and also climate that remain unclear. Now, if you look at the first type of challenge, as I mentioned, I think the markets have adapted to the short-term disturbances that we face from three parallel events. First of all, the asymmetric exit from COVID and all the bottlenecks it created in all the supply chains. Second, the energy tensions in the summer of 21. And third, the impact from the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. But the fact that the markets have stabilized doesn't mean that they came back to their previous equilibrium or balance. We still pay a cost in terms of high food prices. Yes, food inflation has gone down, and many politicians focus on the fact that food inflation has gone down, but food inflation is the annual rate of change with respect to last year or last month. The level of prices and the 100-gram packs that have remained 90-gram packs in supermarkets are there, and they point out to a very significant change in the manner by which households address food, and energy is also a similar challenge. While food inflation is subsiding, I think also farm input costs have remained pretty high, and they squeeze farmers in between what they don't get from the food chain and what they have to pay at the production site. And I've been claiming that sustainable productivity growth is the only way of actually bridging, addressing both food security and climate change challenges. Unfortunately, the term sustainable productivity is not in fashion anymore. It's now called sustainable competitiveness. If we know what we talk about, well, maybe we might change the terms. But what I think is more important is not what happened with the short term, but the new longer-term changes that we face. First of all, in terms of trade, well, at least not only my generation, but even generations before, trade was about comparative advantage. Trade now is about so-called reciprocity and the temperament of the President of the United States of America. And this creates a big unknown and a big question mark that affects trade flows, affects policy discussions, and of course affects the manner by which analysts have to plug in scenarios about what could go wrong or in which direction things are going to go in markets. Second, climate change is both a reality and a contestation. And as a result of that, it affects in a very particular way the only sector that simultaneously emits carbon and sinks carbon. I find very interesting sometimes a debate from former colleagues in the Commission, not from DG Agri, that would throw, and by 2040 or 2050, the emissions from agriculture will be 40, 50 or whatever percent, and this is unacceptable. This is not wrong. This is pure nonsense. If we move towards carbon neutrality, emissions from agriculture should be 100%, because all the other sectors would have reached neutrality, maybe even more than 100%. Forests would be sinking if they don't keep burning and having diseases, and agriculture will be the only sector that would be at the same time emitting and sinking. So the real question mark is not the percentage of emissions from agriculture, but the level of emissions and whether this goes down. And the reason that we have to debate is the third challenge, which is science. And here in the European Union, we have to admit that we have a lot of responsibility about what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic with not only criticism about whether there is climate change or not, on whether the humans have landed on a moon or vaccines, because our debate about applications of biotechnology in agriculture didn't help at all in terms of making clear the role of science. The role of science and the weaknesses and the less focus on science is also coming evident with the frontal attack of what is a public sector analysis in the US, but it's also coming clear with a less and less reliance on impact assessments and analysis on this side of the Atlantic. So where does this link the foreign policy debate? I will show you a graph very briefly, but I'm raising it as a question mark, and it's a graph that with John Buffett from the World Bank that will speak later, we have been dealing with at least 12, 13 years back, which is, do we see in this century a reversal of the very long downward trend in real agricultural prices? If this is the case, this has major implications that we need to address. I'm not going to talk about soil management practices. I mean, you can read what I've written there if you want. For me, and I think it's coming out clearly from the OECD report this year, sustainable productivity is the only way of actually addressing things, and sooner or later we have to simplify the manner by which we think in policy by looking at what farmers do. Farmers do not distinguish the economic and environmental impacts of their activity. They go together at the same time. So now, some questions that could steer probably the debate. What's the extent of the macroeconomic environment on farm production drivers? Here, I would like to see in the discussions we have how input costs, mainly energy and fertilizers, affect the farm and the food productivity. What's the impact of the higher food prices on global demand and on trade patterns? Because food inflation and food prices have not hit every part of the world in the same way. And the question I just asked about a reversal of the downward trend in real prices. How this new world disorder affect agricultural market prospects, on trade tensions, on the climate change adaptation, where tomorrow we have also some presentations focused on this. And for me, a very big question mark, what we do with all this wealth of new knowledge that is being generated from all the research projects that are being financed from private research. I've been in the advisory board of 2 of these research projects, and you see all this new knowledge that tells us what to do to improve our practices, to reduce our footprint, increase productivity, and where do they fit in the policy debate? Both the global farm policy debate, I do have a question mark whether there is a global farm policy debate in the manner that we used to have when you were in WTO, for example, Leanne. How do market prospects impact on the need to coordinate carbon farming, both public and private initiatives? You keep hearing stories about a price of carbon that is set in a very arbitrary manner. And yet, the price of carbon shouldn't be the same in every region or every practice or every soil characteristic. And, of course, where could things go wrong? So those of you that are coming and those that I invite you to stay up until the last panel, that's where it's going to be an interesting discussion. And finally, that's the graph that I meant and mentioned before. What you have here is the real food price index of the World Bank. The World Bank has an agricultural and a food real price index. The difference between the two is that in food, they remove the industrial parts of rubber, tobacco, and John is cotton. These 3 sectors are out, so everything that is food is in. And what you have on the dotted line, well, first of all, what you have here with the red is fertilizers. You see how much bigger the variation of fertilizer volatility is. If you just put the trend that comes out naturally from this graph, you see that something has happened in this century that we haven't seen in the past. You can go back to the 1870s and it was like this, with the exception of 2 or 3 war shocks. We never had such a prolonged period of upward trend. And what you also see here is that's the FAO index of the food consumer prices that also have picked up. So that's a question that at some point needs an answer, and it certainly has foreign policy implications. So that's from the introductory part, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Great. So you can already see some of the big questions that are on the floor for everybody today related to the market disruptions that we're seeking, changes in macroeconomic environment, climate change adaptation. And for me, one of the key things is the question that Tassos raised about science and evidence, and how is that going to inform our policy debates going forward in this world that we're living in now.